The drawing room at Ashvale Park had been arranged with a precision that announced its own authority. 3 branches of candles burned at the table's end, illuminating the documents Mr. Phelps had traveled 2 days from London to present, and Mr. Phelps himself stood behind the documents with the particular confidence of a man who has never been corrected in public. The fire was laid higher than necessary for a September evening. Lady Hartfield had ordered it so. Warmth, she believed, made gentlemen agreeable and women pliant. Cecily Marsh stood near the door where she had been positioned, not seated, not invited to sit, waiting to be useful in whatever way a lady's maid might be useful at a legal gathering she had not been invited to, but had not been excused from either. Her hands were folded. Her face was still. She had learned early in her tenure at Ashvale Park that stillness was the correct answer to most questions. Mr. Phelps had been reading aloud for 20 minutes. He read well. In the sonorous and slightly theatrical manner of solicitors who understand that the weight of their profession is partly theatrical, and the assembled company listened with the expression of people who trust the reading because they could not check it if they wished. And then Cecily heard it. It was small. A single phrase in the codicil's dependent clause, embedded in a thicket of ablative constructions, the kind of Latin that had been copied in haste from an older document by someone who understood the letters, but not the sense. She had heard her father make that error in dictation once, when he was feverish. He had caught it himself, 2 sentences later, and laughed. Mr. Phelps did not catch it. He translated the phrase as a confirmation of the estate's western boundary rights. The phrase, read correctly, placed those rights in contention with the prior deed of settlement. She did not mean to speak. It was the kind of knowledge that a person in her position was understood never to have, and the mere act of deploying it was a transgression as clear as reaching across the table to rearrange another person's papers. She pressed her hands together harder. Lady Hartfield glanced at her then, not with suspicion. With the mild impatience one directs at a clock that is making a noise. Cecily opened her mouth. Edmund Vane, Earl of Ashvale, had not moved from his position at the window since the reading began. His back was to the room. He had said nothing. He said nothing now. Mr. Phelps paused, holding his place in the document with one finger, and looked at her the way a man looks at something that has appeared in a doorway where no thing should be. The maid, he said carefully, need not trouble herself with such matters. The room agreed with the quality of its silence. Cecily had learned to hold her tongue in rooms that arranged themselves this way. She had learned it at 19, the winter her father died and the creditors came, the winter her brother James lost £300 at cards, and she had packed a single trunk and come to Ashvale in answer to a notice in the Cheltenham Chronicle. She had learned that a woman in her position is permitted intelligence the way a room is permitted sunlight, briefly, and through the smallest available aperture. She folded her hands again. She looked at the fire. At the window. He had gone still in a different way. To understand what brought Cecily Marsh to Ashvale Park, you would need to know something about the Reverend Thomas Marsh of Kingsford, Gloucestershire, who had spent 40 years in a draughty rectory with more books than fuel and more Latin than sense, and who had raised his 2 daughters on the reasonable conviction that the mind was God's best gift and the only property no entail could touch. Cecily's sister Harriet had found this charming and largely decorative, useful at assemblies for the impression it made, and otherwise no obstacle to a sensible marriage. Cecily had found it something else entirely. She had read the Aeneid at 12, sitting on the floor of her father's study, with the fire going low, and her father asleep in his chair. And she had gone on reading it for 11 years, without anyone particularly asking her to stop. She read Cicero in the summers. She read Livy in the winters. She read Horace aloud to her father in his last months, because he found it easier to hear than to hold the volume. And she had continued reading it to him in a low voice on the last morning, because there was nothing else she knew to give him, and the words were his, and they were hers, and they were still true. The Virgil was her father's copy. Its spine was cracked along the Aeneid. He had written in the margins in a small, precise hand, corrections and appreciations both, little conversations with a dead Roman across the centuries, and Cecily had read those marginalia as carefully as she had read the poem. She kept the volume in her apron pocket against her side. It pressed there like a warm coal and cost her nothing. She had arrived at Ashvale Park on a damp Tuesday in November the year before, with one trunk, one letter of character from a Mrs. Collins of Cheltenham, and no expectations she had not already lowered several times on the coach journey north. The house was vast in the way of old houses that have accumulated wings without apology, gray stone and bare oaks and the smell of coal smoke and beeswax. Mrs. Brent had met her at the servants' entrance and looked at her once, with the brief comprehensive attention of a woman who has been assessing people at doors for 30 years, and said, "You'll do," in the tone of someone settling a question she had expected to be harder. Lady Hartfield had met her the following morning. She had looked at Cecily the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been delivered in the wrong color. She had looked at Cecily's hands, at her dress, at her face, and then said to her niece Lavinia, who was arranging flowers in the corner and wearing a sprigged muslin that cost more than Cecily's father had paid in annual tithes, "She is just a maid, Lavinia. Do not encourage familiarity." The instruction was directed at Lavinia, but intended for Cecily, who was expected to hear it and know her coordinates. Cecily had heard it. She had known her coordinates for some time. She had first seen Lord Ashvale at a distance of 40 feet in the east courtyard, dismounting from a dark horse in the gray morning light 3 weeks after her arrival. She had been crossing to the still room with a basket of dried herbs and had stopped without meaning to. He was taller than she had expected from the portraits, which were several years old and painted by someone who had emphasized the authority, but missed the exhaustion. He handled the horse with the abstracted efficiency of a man for whom physical management of the world is merely the cost of remaining in it. He had not looked at her. She had gone on to the still room with a peculiar sensation in her chest that she identified, correctly, as the first warning. He was rarely present at Ashvale Park. He came and went on business she was not told and had no occasion to ask about. When he was present, the house arranged itself differently. Drawing rooms that had been comfortable becoming formal, hallways that had been casual becoming trajectories. He said little, and moved with a quietness that was not timidity, but its opposite. In his library, which she had occasion to enter twice in those early months to deliver correspondence, she had noticed that his books were arranged by subject and then by language. Greek, then Latin, then Arabic, Italian, English. She had noticed that his own volumes were marginalia dense, covered in pencil, the annotations of someone who argues with what he reads rather than simply receiving it. She had noticed all of this the way one notices a door in a wall one does not expect to open. In December, Lady Hartfield had invited a company of 12 for a fortnight, the usual architecture of her intentions evident to everyone in the house. Lavinia had been dressed with particular care each morning. Miss Lavinia Hartfield was, in the conventional accounting, everything a sensible man should want. Young, handsome, cheerful, equipped with a small but respectable fortune, fluent in French, proficient at the pianoforte, and entirely free of opinions that might startle. The company approved of her. Lady Hartfield deployed her with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player who has seen 4 moves ahead and found them all favorable. He was polite to Lavinia in the way he was polite to the furniture, consistently and without engagement. It was in December also that the crate had arrived. It had been shipped from a contact in Malta and contained, among other things, 14 letters in mixed Latin and Italian concerning the provenance of a Roman mosaic, 2 clay fragments requiring translation, and a deed of title for a small Sicilian property that the sender believed might have some bearing on the Ashvale family's ancient claims of a settlement made by Edmund's great-great-grandfather. The crate was carried to the library. Edmund had gone directly to it upon its arrival and had not emerged for the better part of 2 days. She had been assigned to carry the morning coal to the library because one of the hall boys was laid up with a bad chest and Mrs. Brent was short-handed, and she had come to the library door on the second morning with the scuttle and found it slightly open. She had not meant to look at the desk. She had not meant to see the pages spread there, or the particular arrangement of languages she recognized, or the small, clear error at the bottom of the deed. She had set down the scuttle. She had gone back to the servants' corridor. She had thought about it all day. The way one thinks about a stone in a shoe, that one is not permitted to stop and remove. On the third morning she had found the door unlocked, and the library cold and empty, Edmund having gone to the north wing at first light to oversee a repair to the roof slates. She had not planned what she did. She had gone to the desk, set down the coal scuttle, and pulled the deed toward herself to read the construction again. It was dawn, and the light through the east windows was the particular pale gold of a winter morning that does not quite promise warmth, and Cecily read the phrase aloud to herself, once, quietly, to be sure. In perpetuum sine reclamation, she murmured. Not in perpetuo. The sense turns entirely on the ablative. She heard, from behind her, the smallest possible alteration in the quality of the silence. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, his coat on, his hat still in his hand, the expression on his face the one she could not decode, neither cold nor warm, nor anything she had a word for. He had been there, she understood, for some portion of her reading. She could not determine what portion. The Virgil was in her apron pocket. She had reached for it without thinking, a reflex as old and involuntary as breath, and it had come partly out of the pocket in her turning, and it lay now at an angle where he could read the spine. His eyes went to it. He read the name there. He looked back at her. "You read Latin," he said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was the flattest, most level declaration she had ever heard, stripped of everything interpretable, and she stood with the deed in her hands and the Virgil half fallen from her pocket, and understood that whatever she said next would be either the last thing she said in this house or the first. "My father was a clergyman," she said. "He had time and few amusements. He educated us as he educated himself." There was a silence between them that was not comfortable and was not uncomfortable, but was simply large, the kind that forms when two people have understood something at the same moment and are each waiting to see what the other does with it. Edmund Vane set his hat on the hall table beyond the door. He came into the library. He went, not to the desk but to the window, and stood with his back to the room. And there was in the line of his shoulders something she had not seen in the 2 months she had been in this house. She looked, then, at the portrait on the wall near the bookshelves. Or rather, she looked at the space where a portrait should have been, occupied instead by a canvas turned to face the wall, its wooden back dusty, a pair of small painted hands just visible at the lower edge where the frame met the plinth. She had noticed it before, and had understood, the way one understands certain silences, that it was not her place to ask. She asked. "The portrait," she said carefully. "Is it someone you would prefer not to see, or someone you cannot bear to?" He was silent for a long time. The coal fire she had laid was beginning to catch. "Theo," he said at last. His voice had the quality of a thing said for the first time in a while, slightly unpracticed. "My son. He was 6 years old. He died of a fever in January of last year." She waited. "I was in Alexandria," he said, "cataloging a collection of Coptic fragments for the Antiquarian Society. The letter from the physician arrived in March. He had been buried 2 months. The fire found its footing and began to steady. Outside the east window, the bare oak moved in a winter wind. "You did not know," she said. "I did not know." He turned from the window. His face was what it always was, still and severe, the jaw a controlled line. There was something beneath the surface of it that she recognized the way one recognizes a word in a foreign language that has the same root as one's own. "I have not entered this room," he said, "since my return, until the crate arrived." She understood then why he had come back to the library when the crate came, and why the portrait was turned, and why the library door was the only one in the house that he opened and closed himself, without assistance. If you have found the comment section below, leave a word there about the story so far. These small acts of attention matter more than you may know. She stood in a library at dawn, holding a Roman deed, and the story was only half told. She looked down at the deed in her hands. She set it, carefully, back on the desk. She straightened the pages without being asked, aligning them to the edge of the blotter. "The error in the ablative," she said, "means the boundary rights are qualified, not absolute. If the codicil that Mr. Phelps is bringing uses the same phrase, and it is read incorrectly, the Hartfield claims on the Western Field could be contested. I do not know if that matters to you." He was looking at her, not with the expression of a man making a calculation, but with something quieter and less comfortable than calculation. "It matters," he said. She nodded. She picked up the coal scuttle, which was still half full and unnecessary, since she had already laid the fire, and she walked to the door, because everything that could happen next was something she was not equipped to survive in the open. He said her name. Not the title. Not Miss Marsh. Her given name, plain and without ornamentation, from across the library. She stopped. She did not turn. "Thank you," he said, "for the fire." She went out. She stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the stone wall, and her hand on the Virgil in her pocket, and her pulse in her throat like a tide she could neither stop nor explain. The days that followed had a quality she did not have a name for, except that the house felt different, in a way she could not see directly, only catch at the edge of her vision. Lord Ashvale continued to be what he had always been, present at meals and absent from them in the same breath, controlled, brief, unreachable by the ordinary instruments of conversation. He was courteous to Lavinia and indifferent to Lady Hartfield's careful arrangements. He came to the library at odd hours. She did not go back to the library uninvited. She was not, after all, unintelligent. He sent for her, however, twice. The first time was 3 days after the morning of the deed, when he had received a letter in Italian from his Malta contact, and wished for a second opinion on a phrase involving a title of nobility. She had translated it. He had read her translation, compared it to his own, said yes, in the tone of a man confirming a result he had already known, and she had gone back to the servants' hall with the sensation of a woman who has passed a test she did not know she was sitting. The second time was a week later. He had found another fragment from the crate, a small clay tablet with a scratched inscription in archaic Latin that the London antiquarians had dismissed as agricultural notation. He placed it before her on the desk without ceremony and said nothing. She had studied it for 10 minutes. It was a harvest prayer, formally inflected, addressed to a local iteration of Ceres. It was not agricultural notation. It was devotion. She had told him so, explaining the verb forms, and he had listened with a quality of attention she had not received from another person since her father died. He had nodded once and said, "I thought so," and the conversation had gone on another 40 minutes in directions she had not anticipated and could not have stopped if she had tried. She did not try. Meanwhile, Lady Hartfield gathered her forces. She had registered the trips to the library, or had registered their effect on Edmund's general demeanor, which was less sealed than it had been. She had registered it the way generals register weather, as a condition to be managed rather than a fact to be accepted. She intensified her campaign on behalf of Lavinia, arranging evenings at the pianoforte, excursions to the North Garden, small private dinners at which Lavinia was seated opposite Edmund and deployed to her best advantage. At one of these dinners, a Tuesday in late September, Lady Hartfield had sent Cecily to the kitchen twice on errands that were, on reflection, entirely unnecessary. Cecily had understood the instruction perfectly. One does not leave the drawing room at a critical hour without being noticed leaving it. She had gone both times without expression, and returned both times to find the table arranged as it had been. Lavinia, bright and attentive, and Edmund watching the candle flame with the expression of a man who is present only because leaving would require an explanation he does not wish to give. On the second return, carrying a small tray of candied fruits that no one had actually requested, Cecily had come in at the far door and been required to cross behind Edmund's chair. She had done so at the correct distance and speed. His hand had rested on the arm of his chair. She had not looked at it. She had been aware of it with the specific peripheral precision of a person who has forbidden themselves to look directly at something, and is therefore more acutely aware of it than they would have been had they simply looked. She had set the tray on the sideboard. She had taken her position near the wall. Lady Hartfield, across the table, had looked at her once with the expression of a woman who has confirmed a calculation she was already confident of, and had turned back to Lavinia and begun speaking of the autumn assembly at Cheltenham. Lavinia was, in all fairness, a kind young woman who bore no one any particular ill will, and had been raised to expect that her aunt would manage her future, and that her future would include an earl. She was not unkind to Cecily. She was something subtler. She was unaware of her. Cecily had spent 23 years being educated by a man who noticed everything, and 2 years in service being trained not to be noticed, and the combination had produced in her a very precise understanding of the difference between being unseen and being uncounted. Lady Hartfield unseen her deliberately. Lavinia did not count her because Lavinia's world had never needed to. The estate gathering had been planned for the second week of October. Mr. Phelps had traveled from London with the codicil papers, which related to a supplementary settlement of the western field boundaries, made by Edmund's grandfather and recently disputed by a neighboring landowner whose solicitor had found a procedural ambiguity in the original deed. The gathering included Mr. Phelps, the neighbor's solicitor, a Mr. Carver of Bristol, 2 witnesses, Lady Hartfield, Lavinia, Edmund, and 3 county gentlemen invited to observe and confirm. On the morning of the gathering, Cecily had gone early to the library, not for the deed. She had not looked at the deed in 2 weeks, having already committed the relevant construction to a careful note in the margin of her own notebook, the same narrow notebook in which she kept vocabulary lists and the occasional sentence from a text she wanted to carry forward. She had gone to the library because it was the only room in Ashvale Park where she could stand for 5 minutes without being useful, and she had needed 5 minutes without being useful. She had stood at the east window, the one Edmund stood at, and looked out at the bare oaks and the frost still on the lawn at 7 in the morning, and she had held the Virgil in both hands without opening it. She had been trying not to think about what would happen if the error in the codicil went unchallenged. She had been trying, less successfully, not to think about what would happen if it did not. Mrs. Brent had found her there, which Mrs. Brent often did, possessing as she did a comprehensive knowledge of where every person in the house was at any given hour. "You know what is in those papers," Mrs. Brent said. It was not a question. Mrs. Brent had a comprehensive knowledge of most things. "I know what is in the original deed," Cecily said. "I cannot know whether the codicil replicates the same phrase. If it does, however, and it is read as Mr. Phelps has been reading it, the outcome will be incorrect. And will you say so?" Cecily looked at the frost on the lawn. "I am a lady's maid, Mrs. Brent." "You are a clergyman's daughter who reads Latin," Mrs. Brent said. "That is a different thing. It is a thing that requires more courage to be." She had left then, which was also her practice. Without waiting for an answer she already knew. Cecily had been assigned to the drawing room to ensure the service was properly managed. She had stood near the door, because the drawing room at such moments had no comfortable place for a person in her position, and she had heard the reading begin. She had heard the error in the second paragraph of the codicil. It was the same phrase, the same ablative construction, copied from the original deed by whoever had drafted the codicil, the same error propagated forward through time with the patient loyalty of mistakes that have never been challenged. She pressed her hands together. She said nothing. Mr. Phelps read on. Lady Hartfield was watching him with the expression of a woman who has invested substantially in a particular outcome. The neighboring solicitor, a younger man named Carver, was watching with an expression Cecily recognized from her brother James's card games, the expression of a man who believes the trick has gone his way. Mr. Phelps reached the dependent clause. He paused. He read it again, silently. He cleared his throat. Lord Ashvale had not been in the room. He had come in 5 minutes before the reading began, taken his position at the window, and remained there, back to the company, in the way he stood in every room that contained a ceremonial expectation. He turned now. He looked at Mr. Phelps. "Continue," Edmund said. Mr. Phelps translated the phrase incorrectly. His translation confirmed the Western boundary rights as absolute. Cecily watched Carver, the neighbor's solicitor, relax by a precise and legible fraction. She opened her mouth. "The maid need not trouble herself with such matters," Mr. Phelps said, before she had made a sound, because the expression on her face had been sufficient, and he was a man who understood the room. Lady Hartfield looked at her with a displeasure so refined it had ceased to be displeasure, and become something structural, something architectural, the face of a house that has decided to close its shutters. "You will wait in the hall," Lady Hartfield said. Cecily went. She stood in the hall with her hands folded and the Virgil against her side, and the error growing in the room behind her, like a root in stone, working slowly and with terrible patience into the gap where it would do its damage. She stood there for 10 minutes. Mrs. Brent found her. "Lady Hartfield has told the company," Mrs. Brent said, keeping her voice low, her eyes on the drawing-room door, "that you are just a maid with ideas above your station. Carver's man repeated it in the corridor. I thought you should know it." Cecily looked at the drawing-room door. "Thank you, Mrs. Brent," she said. She stood in the hall alone. The hall at Ashvale Park was long and cold, and lit by 2 candles in the afternoon, the light thin and the shadows certain. She could hear through the door the murmur of voices, and then a silence, and then the resumption of the reading. Mr. Phelps had moved on to the second codicil, the one she had not seen. She took the Virgil from her pocket. She did not open it. She held it flat between her palms the way her father had held his breviary on certain mornings, when the cold was very bad and the parish very poor, and the consolations of the faith were genuine but abstract. She had asked him once what good it did to hold it without reading it. He had thought about the question with the seriousness he brought to most questions, and said, "Some things you carry because they are true, not because they are useful." The door was 6 feet from her. Through it, a man was reading a Latin phrase he did not understand and presenting its mistranslation as the legal basis for a property claim that would stand, unchallenged, for as long as it took for someone to look at the original deed with the right preparation and the willingness to say what they saw. She had the preparation. She had had it since she was 12 years old, in a cold rectory, with a dead fire and a living poem. She had the willingness. She had known that since the morning at the library window when Mrs. Brent had asked her and she had given an answer that was true, even if incomplete. What she did not have was the invitation, and in the world she had been born into, and the world she had been reduced to, and the world she now occupied at its very margin, the invitation was everything. Without it, one was simply a maid with ideas above her station, which was what Lady Hartfield had already told the assembled company she was, and Lady Hartfield was not incorrect about the category. She was only incorrect about what the category meant. She waited. The decision she could not make without being asked seemed to her the most important decision she had ever not made, and the patience it required was the hardest patience she had ever managed. She heard, through the door, the sound of a chair pushed back. She heard Mr. Phelps's voice, high and slightly agitated, and then a silence. And then his voice, low and level, and carrying the particular quality she had come to know as command. The drawing-room door opened. A footman stood in the doorway. "Lord Ashvale," he said, looking at Cecily. "Requests Miss Marsh." She went in. The room had rearranged itself since she had left it. Mr. Phelps was standing with the codicil slightly lowered, his composure intact but under visible pressure. Carver had leaned back in his chair with his arms folded. The 3 county gentlemen were watching with the quiet attention of men who have understood, collectively, that something of interest is about to happen. Lady Hartfield was seated very straight, her fan held precisely level, and the expression on her face was the expression Cecily had come to understand as the last expression Lady Hartfield permitted herself before real displeasure. Lavinia was looking at the window. He was standing beside the desk, the codicil already in his hands. He held it out to Cecily. "The phrase beginning," he said, "in the second paragraph's dependent clause." She took the document. She read the phrase. She took a breath, small and controlled, and said, "In perpetuum sine reclamatione." In perpetuity, but with the condition of non-contestation held intact. The rights are qualified. The neighboring property retains a right of first petition within any generation of contested succession. She set the document down on the desk. Not absolute. Conditional. The room was very quiet. Carver uncrossed his arms. Mr. Phelps said, with the strained composure of a man selecting his words with great care, "The distinction, if one accepts it, is a matter of archaic usage rather than standard Regency Latin." "My father," Cecily said, because there was nothing else to say, and nothing else that was true, "was a scholar of classical Latin. He taught me the ablative constructions of the Augustan period before I could read English well enough to care about the distinction. I am not asserting anything. I am reading what the phrase says." Lady Hartfield rose. She was magnificent in her rising, carrying the full weight of her position the way one carries a great house on one's back, with the ease of long practice and the cost of it invisible. "This," Lady Hartfield said, "is beyond all propriety. A maid does not read Latin. A maid does not correct a London solicitor at a legal proceeding. A maid does not stand in this room and tell assembled gentlemen what is or is not contained in a deed of title." She looked at Edmund. She expected, Cecily understood, that he would agree with the force of the logic. The logic was the logic of every room she had ever stood in, and it had always worked before. He had been looking at Cecily. He turned now to Lady Hartfield. "She reads it correctly," he said. His voice was level and without inflection, the words measured and final. "She is no longer in your service." The room did not make a sound. Lady Hartfield's fan stopped moving. Lavinia looked up from the window. Mr. Phelps, who had been a solicitor for 23 years and had seen the outcomes of rooms before they finished happening, took a small, careful step back from the table. Carver, the neighbor's solicitor, was already opening his leather case. Edmund turned. He looked at Cecily. "Miss Marsh," he said. And then, deliberately, with the weight of a man who has considered the change and made it. "Cecily." It was the first time. She had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting. She heard it the way one hears a note in a piece of music that resolves something the previous bars had been building toward. And the resolution is so simple and so complete that one wonders how the resolution was ever in question. "Your Grace," she said. She had been calling him my lord. She did not know why she shifted the form of address. It felt, suddenly, like the only appropriate weight. He looked at her for one moment, in front of all of them, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen at the library window and had not been able to name. She had a name for it now. He said, "Come with me." They left the room. In the hall she stopped briefly, because she did not know where she was going, and the hall had two directions, and she had, until 3 minutes ago, known exactly which direction was hers. He had stopped beside her. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of his coat and the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man uncertain, but the stillness of a man who is waiting for something. He does not want to hurry. "Mr. Carver will need to make a filing with the county court," Edmund said, in the tone of a man conducting practical business. "Phelps will correct the translation of record. The matter will be settled within the month." "Yes," she said. "The library will require a second pair of eyes on the Malta correspondence. There are 11 letters remaining." She looked up at him. He was not looking at the hall. He was looking at her, with the expression she had named that morning, and would go on knowing. "I am not in service here," she said. "You said so, in the room." "You are not in Lady Hartfield's service," he said, with a precision that was deliberate. "That is what I said." The hall was cold and still, and smelled of old stone and beeswax, and the faint ghost of whatever had been cooked that morning. And she stood in it and looked at him, and understood that the words he was using were approximate, the way all words are approximate, at the edge of something that has not yet been named, and that naming it was a question of time and not of doubt. "The library," she said. "The library," he said. They walked to the library. The following weeks had the quality of a house in which the windows have been opened after a long winter, a slight rearrangement of air and light that changes the feel of every room without changing the rooms themselves. Mr. Phelps returned to London with the codicil annotated. Carver's client accepted the qualified boundary rights and withdrew the petition for the season. Lady Hartfield departed Ashvale Park for her own establishment in Bath, with Lavinia and without ceremony, and the house breathed out. Cecily was no longer a lady's maid. She was, pending whatever formal arrangement would eventually require formal words to complete, something else. Mrs. Brent understood the distinction before anyone had put it plainly, and adjusted the domestic arrangements accordingly, with the same quiet competence she brought to all rearrangements. The library was Cecily's domain as much as his, and if the house registered the change, it registered it in small ways. A second lamp kept burning late, a second chair drawn to the desk, 2 sets of notes accumulating on either side of the blotter in different hands. The formal words came in late October, in the library, without ceremony, and with a great deal of precision, because he was a man who understood that the most important things are best said exactly. He had stood at the desk with his hands in his coat pockets, which she had come to recognize as his posture of most serious intention, and said that he wished to apply to her brother for her hand, and that he understood the application was a formality, because the question was hers to answer first, and he had no wish to apply to anyone for anything until he knew what she wished. She had said, "I wish it," with the same directness she had used when she told him about the ablative construction, because honesty had been her only real asset in every room she had ever stood in, and she saw no reason to manage it now. "Good," he had said, and there had been the smallest possible alteration in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that precedes a smile in a man who has forgotten how smiling works and is in the process of remembering. The application was made to James Marsh, who was in Gloucestershire with his debts and his wife, and his moderate contrition about the sequence of events that had brought his sister to Ashvale Park in the first place. James had written back within a week with a letter of 3 paragraphs, the first 2 of which were so effusive about the honor that Edmund had read them once and set them aside, and the third of which contained a small, private note to Cecily that said only this: "Father would have liked him. He would have argued with him. He would have liked him very much." Cecily had folded the note into the Virgil, at the Aeneid, on the page where her father's handwriting was densest. The announcement had been made at the county assembly in November, which was the correct venue for such announcements, and which Cecily had attended in a deep green gown that was the first new gown she had purchased with her own money in 3 years. The color, her father had always said, suited the particular quality of her eyes. The room's response had been the room's response, various and predictable, and finally irrelevant. What she had attended to was the specific moment when the announcement was read and the company turned, and she was standing next to Edmund, and he had looked at her rather than at the company, and his look had said everything the room was too far away to hear. In November, when the first serious snow came, she was in the library reading the Multicontact's most recent letter when Edmund came in with a volume under his arm and set it on the shelf beside her father's Virgil. She had known it was coming. In the way she had come to know most of what happened in the library, by a quality of intention she had learned to read in his movements before they completed themselves. He had been carrying the book for 3 days, setting it down in various places, picking it up again. It was his own annotated edition of the Aeneid. The spine was dark with use, and the pages were thick with penciled notes, a conversation with the poem carried on across 20 years. He placed it on the shelf so that its spine touched the spine of her father's copy. She looked at the 2 volumes standing together. "My father would have argued with your marginalia," she said. "I expect so," Edmund said. He turned from the shelf. He was standing very close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the specific gravity of a person who has decided something and is in the act of completing the decision. "I read the Georgics aloud in Alexandria," he said, "in the evenings when the cataloging was done. I thought of Theo. He liked the part about the bees." She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not diminish it. He lifted his hand and held it, briefly, at the edge of her jaw, not touching, just the warmth of his palm in the cold air between them, a near touch that held everything he had not yet said and everything he would say in the time that was beginning now. "Cecily," he said. "Edmund," she said back, the name direct and without title, the first time, and it settled between them like a thing that had always been there and had only needed someone to say it. Outside the library window, the snow was coming harder, laying itself across the bare oaks and the gray stone of the courtyard and the long lawn that ran to the estate's southern wall. The fire in the grate found a fresh piece of coal and caught. The 2 volumes stood on the shelf, her father's Virgil and his annotated Aeneid, their spines touching in the dark above them, and the house was quiet, and the new year was still weeks away, and all of it, at last, was only beginning. If this story moved you, leave a word below for what it was that you found in it. It means more than you know. Thank you for staying until the end.